The Africa Tech Summit was recently held in the Rwandese capital, Kigali, and provided an insight, networking and business opportunities for African and international investors who want to do digital business in Africa. Hello and welcome to this edition of Africa Today. In our show today, we are looking into the rise of startups in Africa and the prospects of the continent's digitalization. We'll also discuss plans by France to boost its military presence in Africa and the rejection of the move by African masses. I'm your host, Mubarak Kenya. Stay with us.
Digital Africa. The three-day Africa Tech Summit, which was held early February in the Rwandese capital Kigali, explored the latest technology trends in Africa and provided a platform to connect digital leaders, tech companies, banks, investors, regulators, startups, and leading tech ventures from across Africa.
I'm a co-founder of Kubitex. It's a Pan-African blockchain solutions company, co-founded by two other people, one from Nigeria, one from Angola. What does it mean? It's about collaboration, connecting the north or the southern part of Africa to the western part of Africa and bringing everybody in Africa on one table to say, guys, let's begin to think of abundance. Let's begin to think of a future of our continent. If we don't do it, nobody will do for Africa. This is a time to build Africa, and this is Africa's time.
I'm here because I want to get to know the startup ecosystem player and many people who are involved into the ecosystem. I just came back from Benin, and I started this initiative last month. The goal was to really try to see how I can bring the conversation around the tech industry across the continent.
This summit and other similar forums indicate that there is a rapid digital transformation in Africa, which could be a game changer for the continent. To discuss this issue, we contacted Alexander Powers, an African business affairs analyst based in Douala, Cameroon, and Sydney Muyambi, the Secretary General of Zimbabwe's Labour Economists and African Democrats. Let's start with Mr. Muyambi. Thank you for joining us. And now, how will the recent tech summit in Kigali change the startup scene in Africa?
It is a sign of good political will by African governments to start investing in technological development. Africa has been lagging behind. The colonial governments did not leave anything to facilitate technology development in Africa. With this meeting, scenes for investment are now beginning to open up.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Powers, for joining us. Now, what's your take on the Africa Tech Summit in Kigali and the future of the digital economy in Africa?
The conference itself, I think, is just an example of the growth in the digital sector. What people should understand is that, 90% of Africans have a smartphone. And I would say a small percentage actually have bank accounts. So the mobile money and these virtual bank accounts are becoming the popular norm. Even personally, I use them. I think it's very convenient, and I think that the West should be looking at this. It's a great technology. So I think these conferences are just the beginning of a start of a revolution here in Africa for tech development.
The annual World Bank Doing Business report was released this year and shows the overall business climate in sub-Saharan Africa is steadily improving. On the ease of starting and maintaining a business, Mauritius and Rwanda rank among the top 20 countries globally, while Nigeria and Togo are among the top global improvers. According to International Finance Cooperation, Africa is full of promising entrepreneurs who are building innovative companies and helping solve some of the continent's most pressing development challenges.
There has been a resurgence of digital financial services springing up all over the country. So we have the PiggyBank, we have the PayStats, we have so many different financial services, all which are targeted at helping people be more disciplined or do more with their funds. So while it's not a fully grown ecosystem, it's still very nascent, I think that it's a journey that is a long one, but we're well on our way.
Are African governments facilitating flourishing of indigenous tech companies? And is it easy to set up a digital business in most African countries?
The environment, the political environment is not good also. Governments may have the will to invest in tech industry, but they don't have the capital, meaning that promotion of local industries in tech development or tech technology is very difficult in Africa.
Mr. Powers, do you think African governments have proper policies in place to assist homegrown tech companies?
The governments are not really helpful, but it doesn't mean that they're trying to be negative. I think most African governments are playing catch up. Is it easy to set up a digital platform? Depends what you're doing. If you're doing mobile money, no, it's complicated. You need a lot of money and guarantees. But if you're just setting up a business portal, sure, it's pretty easy. And you just set up a company and you have your hosting and you're ready to go. So I do think that the opportunities are there.
Working on digital products that can solve Africa's pressing problems is key to making the digital transformation inclusive. Kenya has been mentioned as having one of the well-established innovation ecosystems in Africa. Homegrown successes such as M-Pesa have transformed the East African country into a leading digital nation across the continent. However, such success is yet to replicate it in other African countries.
Now, Mr. Muyambi, what should these upcoming digital companies in Africa do to solve the continent's pressing challenges in sectors such as agriculture, health, and education?
Focus on, for example, the development of indigenous languages as a specific area which cannot be tackled by international companies. In farming, they focus on small-scale production as opposed to large-scale production. Many of these technologies, for example, from the world stage, are prepared for large investment, not small investment like in rural plots by the uneducated African.
Now, on the same note, Mr. Powers, how will digital technology impact on the development of Africa?
I think it's too early to tell how it will affect the continent because a lot of the population still is not tech savvy. They don't understand it. They may have a smartphone, but they don't really understand nor do they trust technology. So there is a divide there. But for the younger generation, definitely there are opportunities where you can connect, especially these portals that, for business to business, business to consumer portals. Those are growing and they're becoming quite popular.
Some of the major Western companies dominating the digital scene in Africa include Google and Facebook and their affiliates, which have virtually taken over the digital advertising industry. Netflix is rapidly pulling subscribers away from local television services and buying content in Africa. The Israeli regime is also reportedly collaborating with Facebook to provide free internet access to African countries in what is seen as digital colonialism.
When we talk about data colonialism, we do not mean it as a metaphor. We are claiming instead that what is going on with data today represents potentially as far-reaching an appropriation of resources as the conquest of gold and territory in historic colonialism. A land grab in digital territory that is likely to have as far-reaching implications as historical colonialism did. A colonial reality, not a metaphor, which we are living and to which we need to wake up.
The Israeli regime's Spacecom satellite communications company plans to provide internet access for sub-Saharan African countries from space. Now, amid the growth of African startups, there is concern of digital colonialism by Western countries which control digital infrastructure. What's your take on this issue?
I think this is a global problem. And this is a major issue in the United States and Europe where you have these big companies, Facebook, Google, Amazon, they're basically monopolizing the industry. Africa has a unique opportunity because these Western companies really don't have that much influence here. Sure, Facebook's huge. Some of these social media, WhatsApp, stuff like that, that's popular. But when it comes to an Amazon, it doesn't really exist out here. There's Jumia, but there's not a lot of competition there. So I think for now, the opportunity is for African companies and African entrepreneurs to benefit from the void from these larger companies.
The basis of digital colonialism lies in control over how technology works. Software is often owned by Western multinationals, which means that users cannot read, modify, or share the source code. Just like the technical architecture of classic colonialism, digital colonialism is also based on the design of the tech ecosystem for the purposes of massive profits and plunder. Leading Western tech companies are also using closed-source software, corporate clouds, and centralized internet services to spy on users in Africa and other parts of the world.
The tools and what is being dispensed is actually saying it will be at no cost to you. That's some form of freedom. That's cool, right? Yay! So, you know, who ran the world? That app, but not the fact that you have freedom of choice. So it's a completely false trade-off that is actually very dangerous and that needs a lot more pushback around, because if we're teaching people the principles, for me, the spirit of the internet is you have to be able to create as much as you consume. So the problem with this mobile phone, and especially mobile first idea, is there are very few spaces. Think about it. How much can you actually innovate on a mobile phone? How much can you actually build using a mobile phone? So yes, we've been told Africa and other places are mobile first, but what does that actually mean when we think about it? We're just creating a next billion consumers and not necessarily the next billion creators.
What should African countries do to build their own digital infrastructure and reduce reliance to the West?
It is a major issue, it's a major concern, and if Africa is smart, they'll diversify and be independent from the West, because in the future, in the long run, Africa will end up being the wealthiest continent, and they will need to be away from their colonial countries, because it can be used against them in the future.
And in this segment of our program, my colleague Sheila Nelima will be presenting you with news and events from across Africa. What do you have today, Sheila?
Thank you, Henia. Hello and welcome to this part of the program. It's Sheila Nelima bringing you news from across Africa. Africa's stolen artifacts. An 18th century crown said to have gone missing from a church in Ethiopia 21 years ago was returned to Ethiopian authorities. The crown was recovered by Sirak Asfau, a Dutch national of Ethiopian heritage, who found it in Netherlands in 1998. Sirak held on to the crown in the fear that it might fall into the wrong hands of those who had stolen it, but later approached the Dutch government, who expedited the rightful return of the artifact. The crown was received in an exclusive ceremony by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Still on the same country, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is facing heavy criticism on the state of affairs in Ethiopia. Following his Nobel Peace Prize award, many complaints have been raised, from journalist Bilal Worku, who sought asylum in the United Kingdom, citing lack of freedom of press and threats against his life by top government officials, and violent arrests and mistreatment by Ethiopian police on opposition supporters, which have peaked towards the forthcoming general election. The Prime Minister is yet to release any statement on the matters. In other news, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda made a stern announcement that he would take serious measures against government officials who fail to implement their duties. The statement was made in the 17th Leadership Retreat as part of the nation's Vision 2050 and was attended by district mayors, heads of institutions, ministers and others. He emphasized on eliminating the mismanagement of public funds that would lead to faster development and urged leaders to speak up whenever public funds are stolen. Now to a growing scandal in Nigeria. Corruption is said to be operating in full force, with the International Monetary Fund downgrading Nigeria's economic growth from 3% to 2% President Buhari's government is under heavy scrutiny. The president and his finance minister have massively increased borrowing and justify it as necessary to finance government spending. The latest being a $2.2 billion loan from the World Bank to improve immunization and the environment. Questions are coming up as to just how necessary the country's borrowing really is. The Buhari administration, however, believe that to ease the debt burden, the country has to borrow more with low interest and long repayment periods from different institutions. Now, in the field of economics, Senegal's new Startup Act that is meant to come into effect later this year has been deemed a promising one for the young population. The law applies to all startups, however, targets women and youth-run businesses, prioritizing on digital technology. Drafted in 2018 with the help of Senegalese entrepreneurs, the law grants companies a 3-year tax-free grace period as well as training. The government is yet to create a platform that will register startups, which is expected to be done by mid this year. That's all for this part. Visit and follow us on our social media pages on Twitter and Instagram and send in your views and comments on the program. Do stay tuned. We will be back soon.
France militarizing Africa.
France has announced plans to boost military presence in Africa, but young people in the continent are now fed up and have been holding protests to reject the expansion of French imperialism.
France established military bases in Africa during the colonial period and maintained a military presence in Africa after the superficial independence of its former colonies in the 1960s. The list of French military interventions in Africa is long, and they're all carried out under the pretext of human rights protection, democracy, or the fight against terrorism.
A 30-strong convoy of armoured vehicles and refuelling trucks set off on the RN16 road between Gossi and Hombori in central Mali, close to the border with Burkina Faso. It is March 27th and several hundred French soldiers are launching the first major offensive of its kind in the region as part of Operation Barkhane, the anti-insurgent operation launched in Africa's Sahel region in 2014.
The reality is that all these military adventures have ulterior objectives, mainly securing French interests on the resource-rich continent. To further analyze this issue, we contacted Daniel Lazare, a New York-based journalist and author. Thanks, Mr. Lazare. Now, what's your take on the decision by France to increase its troops in Africa?
Well, these are areas of Africa where France has traditionally maintained a presence, and France is always trying to increase its international profile by buttressing its neo-colonial activities. So France is trying to step up its activities in Africa and kind of prove that it's still a force to be reckoned with in that part of the world, and perhaps also.
The major difference between then and now is that France is now moving beyond unilateral intervention. France is working in cooperation with African Union troops and within a large European force in its military adventurism in Africa.
It is France that fights terrorism at its source. And in this fight, we are not alone. We can count on our European and American allies, on the MINUSMA, as well as on local forces, including the joint force of the G5.
French plans to send some of its troops in Africa under the auspices of European forces or in joint peacekeeping role with African Union peacekeepers. Is this change of strategy by France?
I think that France's activities are broadly consistent with its strategy in the area over the years, but a few things have changed. The most important of which is the situation in Libya, which goes from bad to worse. The fall of the Gaddafi regime led to a spread of weapons and anarchy, not only in Libya itself, but throughout the broader Sahel region. And this is wreaking havoc across the continent.
The reinforcements will mostly be sent to the area between Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. Another part will join the G5 Sahel forces. The G5 Sahel Joint Force is a major African initiative bringing together Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, Niger and Chad, and supported by the African Union and the United Nations.
The Sahel is a semi-arid area stretching more than 2,000 miles across West and Central Africa that is plagued by violent groups loosely affiliated with the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. France already has 4,500 soldiers stationed in the Europe-sized region as part of Operation Barkhane, supporting local armies that in 2017 launched a joint anti-terrorism G5 Sahel force.
Instability in the Sahel has created a pretext for France to send more troops to the region. Now, what's the root of the conflict in this resource-rich region of Africa?
I think that imperial ambitions is one very important source of conflict. Another source is the economically deteriorating nature of the regions. Climate change is also a factor, and I think the growing anarchy in Libya, which is spreading throughout the Sahel, is equally as important. Now, of course, France took part in the destruction of the Gaddafi regime, which means that it bears responsibility for the amazing chaos that has taken place after the fall of Gaddafi.
The Sahel region in Africa started experiencing insecurity and invasion by terrorists following the 2011 US-led NATO war in Libya and the resulting French war in Mali starting in 2013. The region is facing increasing security threats as France steps up its deployments in the strategic resource-rich region in its former colonial empire. The plan by France to increase troops in Africa comes amid a report that the United States is planning its presence in West Africa.
I'm reviewing our force posture and activities in Africa, for example. State Department has a big role there, as does USAID. I've been around USAID on the ground in different parts of the world. Another important component, another key factor in national security.
Some analysts say that Americans are making empty threats when they talk about leaving the Sahel. Now, what's your take on U.S. claims that it plans to reduce the number of its troops in West Africa?
I think the U.S. is grossly overextended throughout the entire world, and it has little idea of why it maintains such a far-flung military network, and is trying to economize, to bring the troops back, to consolidate its positions, to focus on only a few areas. But U.S. policy grows more and more incoherent, and as it does, it seems to get in more and more trouble.
The African Union was established to emancipate Africa from reliance on colonial powers, but now African countries have to go back to these same ex-colonial powers for assistance. In this case, there is bound to be divergent political visions and priorities, which weaken the African Union's efforts to restore peace across the continent. Why are African countries unable to deal with the growing insecurity in the strategic Sahel region?
Because the political chaos is spreading, and then those governments are victims of that chaos. I mean, guns are spreading, Salafist ideas are spreading. I'm sure there's Gulf money, Persian Gulf money in North Africa, which is helping to purchase arms and buy political support and help and cause the anarchy to spread even further. So there's a widening wave of chaos, which is engulfing these countries.
And on that note, we come to the end of this edition of Africa Today. Do join us in our next edition. From me, Mubarak Kenya, and my team is goodbye.